Welcome to another edition of Community Matters. I'm Jim Cameron, your program director and the host of this program. And as you, a faithful viewer, knows, this is a show where we talk about things of interest in the local community. And our guest today on the program has written a book on a topic that I find fascinating, not only because of local history, but also because of my strong interest, as many of you know, in transportation. Eric Jaffe is our guest today. Eric is the editorial director at Sidewalk Labs, which you should look up online. It's an innovation site that helps cities address big challenges, all kinds of challenges, including transportation. He got his BA from the University of Michigan, a master's in science at Columbia University, and he has worked previous to his authorship of this book 10 years as a journalist, writing for The Atlantic, Fast Company, Smithsonian, among others. In 2014, he wrote a series on the future of transportation, which I'm going to have to read. He's also the author of two history books, A Curious Madness, written in 2014, and the book that we're here to talk about today, which is called The King's Best Highway. Show us the book, Eric.
Sure,
Hold up
Jim.
the cover.
And thank you for that very generous
Excellent
introduction. There's the book.
Excellent. Great. So this is not a thin book. I got my copy, and it took me a while to wade through it. I thought it was just going to be a history of the Boston Post Road, but it turned out to be a lot more than that. And we're going to try and cover many of the things that you discussed over the centuries of looking at this particular highway. But first of all, what was it that got you interested in writing this book? And what kind of research did you have to do to be able to make it such a weighty tome?
Yeah, it's funny. It's funny you mentioned that it's not really a book about the Boston Post Road, because I always thought about the Post Road almost as a character, right? And this character would guide you through the social transformation of the country over 4 centuries. And so it wasn't so much, the antiquarian question of where did the road go here and this date. That had been studied actually by a writer named Stephen Jenkins in 1910. It's a hard book to find, but if you find it, it's got a rich trove of local history all up and down New England. But my own interest, started when I moved to New York City. And as you mentioned, I went to Columbia to study journalism. And one day we were in the Bronx doing some reporting, and there is a Boston Road in the Bronx. And this is a highly unusual road, or a highly unusual name for a road, a couple blocks away from Yankee Stadium. So you would put 2 and 2 together and say, why would New York name a road after their great rival here? And then as you looked into it and you heard, or as I found, that this actually went all the way back to colonial times, connected New York and Boston in the earliest days of our country so they could communicate. I just got fascinated by it, wanted to read more.
You make an interesting point in the book, which is that transportation equaled communication. That how long did it take to get a letter from Boston to New York in colonial times?
Yeah, I mean, we forget that for a long, long time, to get a message somewhere, somebody had to physically take it there, right? I mean, it seems so obvious, but we forget that now because, we're talking and I'm not physically where you are. But in the early days, so when they had this idea for a Boston Post Road between New York and Boston, this was in the 17th century. To be very specific, the very first trip that occurred on this road was January 1673. So actually about this time, all the way back in 1673. And the goal at that point was to do 14 days there and 14 days back. And we know for a fact that the first post rider didn't hit that, because it took at least 3 weeks for him to just get to Boston. He started in New York at that time.
And did he follow what we think of today as Route 1 along the coast, or did he go a little more inland?
Yeah. So the Boston Post Road kind of has a fork, as you mentioned. One goes along the coast right around US 1, and it goes up through Providence into Boston. And then the other cuts up at New Haven and then goes through Hartford, makes a hard right at Springfield, and then goes into Boston from the east, or goes eastward that way. The very first post rider went through Hartford, And that was primarily because one of the originators of the postal road, the system, was Connecticut's Governor John Winthrop Jr. And he lived in Hartford at that time. And so this was really a joint effort between him and Francis Lovelace, the governor of New York. And the first post rider had to stop in Hartford to consult John Winthrop Jr. and say, hey, where should I go from here? What am I doing wrong? What am I doing right? How can we improve this system? So he had to travel up through that inland road.
And when you say he was a post rider, does that mean he was carrying postal mail?
Exactly, right? And so the idea of this, post road between New York and Boston, for a few reasons. One was communication, right? How can we get letters from these two very important points with all these intermediary important points as well, also staying in the loop. There was trade implications, commercial implications as well. But I think the primary reason was actually a form of resistance, a form of defense for New England at that time. The Dutch had very strong colonial interests as well, and they had actually, held Manhattan for a while and would again. And so they had to make sure they were on the same page. New York and Boston and parts of Connecticut, they had to be aware if there were looming threats of another Dutch attack. So for all these reasons, they had a post rider go from New York to Boston. And it was, it's not, this was a very active postman, right? Maybe not what we think of today when we have the stereotypes of Newman in Seinfeld, right? But this was a rider had to travel through, all night, all day, no maps, no guides at all. In fact, this rider, in addition to delivering the mail, was tasked with actually marking trees so that other travelers could follow the way. He had to spot places for taverns or inns where we could drop the mail next time around. He actually was also tasked with catching fugitives, right? This was just kind of the general conductor of life in the Northeast.
And the recipients of the mail paid to get the mail, not the person that sent it. I found that interesting too.
That's right.
So you could look at a letter and say, I don't want to pay threepence. This is from Jones. I don't care what he's writing.
Right. He's spamming me, right? It's the earliest form of spam. And this was it's funny, but it also actually became an important concern because the post office was unable to support itself financially. This colonial postal system, right? A lot of people, they got this letter, as you point out, they didn't want it. Or what happened more often was they just didn't go down to the tavern to pick it up. So it sat there and nobody got paid. And the Crown, meanwhile, didn't care to support this type of effort. They didn't want the colonies to have good communication, most likely. And so this didn't really change until Benjamin Franklin got involved, actually.
And along the route, there were stone markers placed indicating how far it was to Boston or New York. Who put those up? And I think some of them are still around. You can see them today, right?
There are a few around. I think at one point, or when I was doing the book, at least there was 19 between Springfield and east of Springfield. There's not that many left today, but it was actually Franklin who originally laid those mile markers. And the reason he got involved, was interesting. He had his own newspaper, or his own newsletters, what they called it at that time. And a lot of people that had their own newsletter got interested in the Postal Service for obvious reasons. This was how you sent something to your subscribers. But what would happen is if a postmaster was started one newsletter and he didn't like another guy's newsletter, he just would tell his riders not to carry it. And so Ben Franklin didn't like that for obvious reasons. He actually wanted this spirit of communication to be more egalitarian and want everybody's newsletter to be able to travel along the road. But he had to fix the post office before he could do that. So he went on this massive tour between New York and Boston in 1753, and he comes up with all kinds of improvements. So he starts new post offices in intermediary points. He starts actually a home delivery service for a small fee. You can get this delivered right to your door. You don't have to go to the tavern. He starts what we know today as the dead letter office. So it wasn't sitting there forever. It actually got sent to some central repository where they could file it and organize it. And he created rate tables so that all of the post riders understood, okay, I've traveled this far. This is how much this person owes me. And it was very clear and it was marked on every letter. But to make those rate tables work, you had to know how far you went, right? So Ben Franklin, being the kind of genius he is, he actually invented the odometer so that he could mark off when you've gone a mile. And then in 1763, he, tracked out, here's the various mile markers, and had, worked with folks to create these little milestones. And those are the things we saw dot the post road from thereafter.
Eric Jaffe is our guest. He is the author of the book entitled The King's Best Highway. Uh, so we're in the 1700s now. What was the road like? Was it a dirt road? Was it a corduroy road? And who maintained it?
It was an awful road at that time. I think it would be the best way to describe it. I mean, it was definitely a dirt road. More frequently, it was probably a muddy road. There's this famous joke that kind of persisted for centuries, which is somebody in New England sees a hat laying in the middle of the road and picks it up, and there's a person underneath it, and he says, "Hang on a second, I actually have a really good horse down here." So like that typified exactly the condition the roads were in. And the reason was we didn't really understand road engineering. We didn't understand that at all until actually the late 19th century. And so what they would do in the 1700s and 1800s, all the people in a town, probably mostly the men in a town, would gather once a year for something they thought of as road day. And on this road day, they were supposed to kind of clear the big rocks out of the way and make sure the lines of the road were still kind of discernible for travelers. But most of the time, they just kind of joked around and did foot races and actually drank.
They were kind of commandeered to do that, right? This was
you had
responsibility
to.
of every man.
You had to do it as part of your duty as a citizen of that town. And in fact, some people paid others to go in their place. So people didn't really take it very seriously, and the result was the poor roads that we got. And this persisted kind of until toll roads came into effect.
You mentioned the T word, and I was going to ask that question next. As you know, it's been a controversial issue in Connecticut. When did tolls come to these highways, especially the old King's Highway or the King's Best Highway? And why didn't they last?
Yeah, and so you started to see these toll roads, these turnpikes emerge in the 1700s because exactly for this reason, people didn't like traveling on these really crummy roads. And also these were, the toll roads and the turnpike roads, they were owned by private corporations. They thought we could make some money off of this. So it was actually a physical pike that you could not, go past without turning it, which is where that comes from. And you had to pay a charge as part of that. And now these were much better roads, right? Because again, a private corporation had an interest in keeping them clean. But what they found over time was nobody likes to pay for roads. Nobody likes to pay for traveling on roads. And you know what? If you had to go out of your way 10 minutes to use the Boston Post Road instead of the new turnpike that paralleled it, you did that because the Boston Post Road was free, even though it was in crummy condition, but it was free, and no one likes to pay for roads. And so over time, almost all of these private corporations, these private turnpikes, they failed. And what would happen then was written into the contract is they became public. So a lot of them actually started off as private, and we know them today as the public roads we have.
So let's fast forward about a century because we're making a good time down this road discussing about your book. It's generally thought that it was Henry Ford and the invention of the automobile which led to the creation of better highways today. But in your book, you point out there was a guy by the name of Hiram Percy Maxim who had another invention that really made the roads better.
So actually, this was Albert Pope.
Oh, I take it back. Okay.
Yeah,
that's right. Yep.
Maxim eventually worked for Pope to create cars, but originally Albert Pope took an interest in what later became the Good Roads movement, and that's because he was an entrepreneur for bicycles. He really popularized bicycles in America in the late 19th century. So we're starting after the 1870s. Bicycles became a pretty big hit. Now, for a while, you've seen those old pictures of the velocipedes, and there's one big wheel in the front and one small wheel, and they look impossible to ride, and they were impossible to ride. But over time, the engineering improved, and we got what we know today as safety bicycles, where the wheels are even, and it's just much easier to ride. And so you saw this proliferation of people riding bikes into town, out of town. It was a real leisure activity. And it had a real cultural impact too, because women started to ride bikes. This was, actually a controversial issue for a while. They had to have slightly shorter pants to ride bikes because otherwise their pants would get caught in the spokes. And that was, at that time, a matter to remark on. And so you started to see all of these cultural transformations come into play. But the problem that Pope saw was that the roads, as we discussed earlier, they were still so terrible that people they chose not to bike for that reason, not for cultural reasons anymore. And so he starts really lobbying to get better roads. He calls it the Good Roads Movement. He puts out publications. He starts magazines. He publishes little maps, little guides that show you, here, you're in this post-road town. You can actually travel on this road, and it's in pretty decent condition, and you can take your bike and you can have a nice little trip out of town. But even that wasn't enough, right? He just wanted the roads themselves to be improved in a fundamental way. So he starts lobbying the federal government. The federal government at this time had no office that looked into road creation at all. In fact, many of the states opposed the idea of road creation. They called it unconstitutional. And so Albert Pope, he got this big band behind him that pushed the Good Roads movement. At one point, they had a mile-long petition that they actually wheeled around a bicycle tire, and they delivered it into Congress like that. And he won the day. In 1893, there was a little line item in the budget for $10,000. It was, even at that time, not enough to build, I think, more than 2 miles of road. But the point was, they had made a statement. Roads actually matter at this federal level. We need somebody to be thinking about the conditions of our roads. And it was called the Office of Road Inquiry. And over time, it evolved into what we know as the Federal Highway Administration. So.
Now, it was also 1893 when Frank Durie made an invention, which again flies in the face of everything we've been taught in school about Henry Ford. What was Durier's invention? And he was from Connecticut as well, too, was he not?
Durie was from Springfield, Massachusetts.
Close enough.
Or at least, I'm not sure if he was born there, but he definitely lived the bulk of his life there.
Yeah.
And he might have been born there. But Durie, you're right. I mean, all the historical revisionism is that Henry Ford, brought cars to America, and Henry Ford changed the roads. And in fact, it was Albert Pope who changed the roads. And Frank Durie is, by most historians who care to kind of look closely at this, credited with creating the first successful gasoline automobile. And so this was in 1893. He took it out on the roads of Springfield, Massachusetts, including the Boston Post Road, to test it out and to refine it. And what was interesting is that, I had no idea about this. You probably knew this, but at that time, the late 19th century, there was a big contest about what type of power would be used for automotive transportation, right? There were some gasoline cars like Durie, but there were also electric vehicles, and there were even steam vehicles, which I think outsold any for a number of years. And so until the discovery of oil wells in Texas really broke big, I think that was a really interesting competition that wasn't resolved. But Frank Durie gets credit for being first to the gasoline car that we know today.
Bridgeport has a little piece of automotive history, which I wrote about once, which you might not know. Buckminster Fuller's Dymaxion car was built in Bridgeport, but that was, well into the 30s or maybe the 20s at least as well.
Sure.
So around 1925, Route 1, the Boston Post Road, is in most places just one lane in each direction.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the main way that people get between Boston and New York, cars and trucks. What happened in 1925 to try and deal with that congestion issue?
Yeah. So a couple of things happened in 1925. The first is that little Office of Road Inquiry that Albert Pope had helped to start, it had evolved into, it took many names over the years. I think maybe by this point, the Bureau of Road Inquiry, but it had a much bigger budget. And it said, you know what, the first thing we need here is maps. There are all these cars on the road. It's the 1920s, millions of Americans now own their own cars. They have no idea how to get around. We need to create these maps and these consistent routes. And so that's eventually where you see US Route 1 start to emerge, because they do this whole analysis of the main thoroughfares connecting major cities. And they decide that, at least in New England, between New York and Boston, the Boston Post Road along the shore through Connecticut was the primary route and should be US Route 1. But at the same time, they recognized that traffic was horrible, right? Like, to your point, there was one lane in each direction. I think the total width of the road was something like 18 feet. And they didn't have any hope of kind of widening the roads as fast as they could to keep up with the interest in car transportation. You had Connecticut's highway commissioner at one point literally say the words, "We have no hope of keeping up with traffic." You could probably say that today too, but certainly then they really meant it. And so you start to see at that point in time is the first attempt to reduce congestion, which was parkways.
And that was Robert Moses in Westchester County. But in the 1930s, it was the introduction of the Merritt Parkway.
Right. So that's exactly right. You had Robert Moses explore this in New York. So you started to see things like the Hutchinson River Parkway. And the idea being, we'd parallel some of these really important roads, US 1, but we'd make the road much nicer. It would go through wooded areas, and there would be kind of a calmness to it. There's a lot of turns in parkways, as you know, and this actually ended up being a detriment, because at that point in time, cars didn't go very fast. At the speeds they can go today, having that many turns is actually very problematic and unsafe.
And the Merritt was also built without any stoplights, the first clover leafs and overpasses. And let's fast forward a little bit further as well too. And we haven't talked about the railroads yet, but you wrote about that as well. I'll try to come back to that, but let's finish this highway theme. Our guest is Eric Jaffe, author of the book, The King's Best Highway. Who was Lester Barlow from Stamford, and what was he concerned about with all these highways?
Yeah, so right around this time, right, where everyone's having these conversations about how do we fix this problem of so many people wanting to drive and now having access to their own cars, but our roads being, basically no better than they were in the colonial times. How do we fix that problem? So Lester Barlow applied his, let's say, eclectic mind to this problem. He actually invented bombs during World War I, a very eclectic fellow. So he's a separate story. But he pitches this idea. He comes up with this idea of what we know today as an expressway, right? So it wouldn't just be this dirt road. It wouldn't even just be a paved road. It would have different types of lanes. One would be for fast traffic. One would be for slow traffic. It would have access ramps. It would have service stations. It's basically everything we know today of an expressway. Lester Barlow's thinking of this back in originally 1925, but in 1930, he takes his pitch directly to the governor of New York, who was at that time FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And Roosevelt was really into roads. It was a kind of clear demonstration of what government could do to improve people's lives. And he was really into this idea. And he gave Barlow the sense that they would move forward with this idea. And the very first project was going to be a new expressway that would parallel the Boston Post Road from New York City to New Haven. This would be a demonstration project for the entire country to mimic. And the bill that Lester Barlow pitched, or the idea that Lester Barlow pitched, made it all the way up into Congress, into a bill, but it got stuck in committee and it never got out.
So how did what we referred to as the New England Turnpike, the Connecticut Turnpike, how did that get built? The predecessor to what we know and love as I-95.
Exactly. And so again, still around this time, you mentioned the Merritt. You had the Merritt emerge in the late 30s. Within years, right? Within, I think, 5 years, it was packed. It was just jam-packed still with cars, because as we know today, and we can discuss more, the more roads you build, the more people drive. It is a very direct correlation. The Merritt was packed. Even by 1942, 43, in the middle of World War II, it was packed. And Robert Moses wanted to build yet more roads so that New York could alleviate its congestion, or at least he hoped would alleviate its congestion. And he put pressure on Connecticut to do the same thing. He said, I'm planning this thing. We're going to call it the New England Thruway. It's going to start here in New York. It's going to be the biggest thing since the Erie Canal. And I'm going to build it right up to the state line. And if you don't build it, here's the problem you're going to have when these thousands of motorists every day descend on what is your little parkway still in Connecticut. And Connecticut rightfully got very scared about this. But they didn't want the political implications of telling all of the residents of the state that we're going to build this really big road and it's actually going to cut right through your town and maybe even your neighborhood. So they hid it, they disguised it in legislation. They called it this little improvement through Stratford, Connecticut. And finally, somebody figured out what they were doing, and a bunch of towns start this campaign. I think Westport led the campaign. It was called the Stop the Road campaign. They didn't want things to go directly through their town. And just to give an example for Darien, that road that Robert Moses conceived and that Connecticut agreed to at that time would have gone through 30 homes in Darien within a mile and a half. Just totally gutted them. But, and there's a but to this story, everybody knew the post road was terrible too, or by that time they called it US 1. So it was still, what do I pick your poison, really? And so a lot of people said, you know what, I don't want, a new road going through 30 homes in our town, but I also don't want to spend my day stuck in traffic on Route 1. And it turned out only 1 in 5 residents of Darien actually opposed the idea for the new expressway. And in 1953, it was approved, and they called it officially Relocation of US Route 1. I think you know why that name didn't stick. But.
And actually, one of the first sections of that was started to bypass the downtown area in Darien by a trucking company, I believe. And the reason that the Boston Post Road in Darien is one of the last bucolic truck-free parts of US Route 1 in Connecticut is because of the railroad bridge in downtown, which is still too low for trucks.
Right.
And every now and then a truck hits that bridge, peels off the top of it, and there's a discussion about either raising the railroad bridge or lowering the road. And the town says, absolutely not. That is what's protecting our town from further trucks.
That's funny. That's funny, yeah.
Moving forward a little bit more, after I-95 gets built, there is then in the 60s, I guess it was, new interest in who was Lewis Mumford, and what was his idea of this balanced transport concept?
It's funny, just a real quick aside, you mentioned some of the first stretches of 95. In 1964, actually the last section of I-95 was completed, the last section between New York and Boston, I should say, and it was opened from Groton to the state line of Rhode Island. And what they did to celebrate it was not kind of zip the fastest car imaginable in the 60s down the line, but they actually had a stagecoach pulled by horses, and they wanted to honor the Colonial Post Road predecessor. And it was a really nice kind of punctuation point in the history of the road.
It was like Mario Cuomo driving a 1930s roadster across the New Tappan Zee Bridge.
Yeah, there you go. Something like that.
As well,
a little bit of history, at least, to remember.
But again, 95 got immediately jammed up, and there was discussion of, hey, what's this old railroad track sitting next to the I-95? It parallels it in most of the distance of Connecticut. So who was Mumford, and what was his idea?
Yeah. And so Lewis Mumford was just kind of an urbanist and a writer. He wrote for the New Yorker, actually, for many, many years. But he was kind of, what we think of today as an urbanist, just fascinated by architecture, fascinated by development form, and fascinated by the ways that kind of people convene in urban environments. And he kind of realized, before anyone else, still today people struggle with this, but he realized that the more roads we build, the more cars we have, right? There is this direct connection. And every time we try to solve congestion with roads, we just get more congestion because it makes more people want to drive because they think they can do so in a cheap way and in a fast way. And so Lewis Mumford kind of took the opposite approach here, and he battled with Robert Moses, and he kept saying, if this is our only solution, we're just going to get the same problem, right? You've seen it. You saw it initially with the post road when you widened it. You saw it with the parkways. You're going to see it with I-95. It's just going to happen because it's a fundamental rule. And the other part of what Mumford wanted to protect against was roads cutting directly through cities, right? And so we talked about Darien losing some homes potentially, but we know what happened with urban renewal in the 60s. There were terrible, terrible examples, in New Haven being one, where highways cut through entire neighborhoods. Hundreds of people lost their home. And the idea was we could build back, but we never did. And so, you had all these kind of, grievances and these injustices occur at that time. And Lewis Mumford says we need to think about this fundamentally differently. We need a balanced transportation system. Cars are a part of it, but they're not all of it. And his view actually was that we should move toward a system where we had kind of smaller communities where everything's available within a short trip. Doesn't even have to be a car trip. It's a bike. Maybe you can walk to the store, but everything's available to you within your community, and that's connected by big trunk lines that are maybe major highways or major rail hubs, but it's not this endless network of roads that we have today. He obviously didn't win that battle.
And then in the 1960s, Rhode Island Senator Claiborne Pell said, we're dealing with a railroad line, which we haven't really discussed much, all the way from New York to Boston, along the coastline, that was built by the New Haven Railroad 100 years ago, and it runs about as fast as the trolleys did at their high speed. So it was Senator Pell that introduced the idea of high-speed rail, right?
Yeah. So you had this, you had this railroad network emerge, and it really parallels the Boston Post Road for obvious reasons. All we've been talking about is you saw culture and you saw society evolve along these roads. They had to remain basically in the same place because that's where the people were. And so the railroad kind of really copied that basic skeleton framework exactly in some places, actually in Boston. But the railroad over time, certainly by the 1960s, it wasn't the fastest option. I think Claiborne Pell at one point, if I'm remembering, called the sleeper car the waker car. It just wasn't a fun journey, right? And like stagecoach travel before it, and like trolley travel sometimes, it was a tough day to have to do all of that. And so he really pushes for better rail, high speed rail. This is back in the 60s. It actually led to the original Metroliner trains, but private railroad just wasn't going to make it against the vast road network that emerged after the 50s with the Highway Act. And so you had the government step in. Amtrak took over. We have the Amtrak Metroliners, and the idea that Claiborne Pell wanted, we never quite achieved it.
Took about 50 years to get up something a little bit faster speeds. But before we let you go, you wrote this book, and it covers 300 years between the first Indian trails and the invention of the King's Highway and the Boston Post Road, all the way up through the current situation with Amtrak running slightly faster trains, I-95 still being congested. I imagine you've given some thought to what the future is going to be, and especially with the spin on what we might have learned out of the COVID pandemic. Because going back to what you said earlier, transportation equals communication, and if we can communicate without the transportation, do we need the transportation? What do you see as the future?
I think what COVID is showing us that's really interesting, that we've known, but that has really come into stark relief with this terrible pandemic, is that we actually have enough roads for everybody if they're not all traveling at the same time, right? It's rush hour that's the problem. It's those peak Thanksgiving holiday periods that's the problem. It makes it feel like, oh, we just need more. And remote work is kind of posing the question of, should we revisit the classic rush hour commute down to the central business district, which, let's face it, is really a relic of the industrial age when we had to separate factories from where people lived. And the answer is maybe not. Maybe we don't need that. Maybe we actually capture some of what Lewis Mumford was talking about, where we just build nodes of neighborhoods that are both work and play and a home, and we connect them, with important trunk lines. But these are trunk lines that have enough capacity for a typical volume of traveler, but don't have to be used every day at the same time by basically everyone. And so I think, one question this really raises is, can we think about how we travel to work and when we travel to work in a different way? And I think the answer is probably yes.
Well, we'll just have to stay tuned to see how that all shakes out. But I really want to thank you for being a guest on our program today.
Sure.
Eric Jaffe, the book is entitled The King's Best Highway. It is available in some local libraries and certainly still available on Amazon. And I wish you all the best, and thank you again for being with us on the program.
Thank you, Jim. Happy to be
And
here.
thank you for watching another edition of Community Matters.